This is the story of a woman who wasn't supposed to amount to much. It's a story of struggle against years of determined opposition to earn a crown and to forge a kingdom and eventually a nation out of a collection of feuding aristocratic factions and territories. It's a very human story about how personal decisions and convictions came to shape the destinies of thousands, even millions of people. It's a story of discovery, and it's a story of loss. We remember this woman today as the second name in a pair, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. The fact that we remember her name at all is a credit to how effective and how powerful she was. Because the monarchies of other countries in Europe at the time, the King of Portugal, the King of France, the King of England, they all had wives. They all had queens. But those women were just the vehicles for producing legitimate heirs. They wielded no political power, at least not officially, in their own right. But in Spain, the crown had two faces, and one of them was female. You're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is the first episode in a series that focuses on Spain and a woman that you've probably heard about only in passing, but will know far more about by the time we're done. Now, this is the same Ferdinand and Isabella who you heard about in your high school history class because they were responsible for sponsoring a guy called Christopher Columbus, who had this crazy idea of sailing where no one from Europe had sailed before. And they're also the parents of a woman named Catherine of Aragon, who you might remember from some of our other series on this podcast, because she was the first wife of Henry VIII of England. But that comes much later. Our story today begins in the year 1451. It's important to recall, as this narrative develops, that while I'm speaking about Spain, it's not Spain as you and I know it today. It wasn't a nation state. It didn't have a unified government or a national identity. It would be, in fact, more correct to refer to it as the Iberian Peninsula and just simply indicate the geographic region, which is the canvas on which our story unfolds. And it's a canvas that is populated by various kingdoms. And sometimes these kingdoms work together, and sometimes they are rivals. The largest and wealthiest of these kingdoms is in the west of what we'll now call Spain, and it's the Kingdom of Castile. But its larger eastern neighbor is the Kingdom of Aragon, and then there are other kingdoms like Valencia and Navarre, to name just a few. And in the south, there's the Kingdom of Granada, which is ruled by a people who were then called Moors. In the 700s, the Moors, who were Muslim, had invaded the Iberian Peninsula from North Africa, rapidly spreading north, taking over enormous amounts of territory and cities as they went. So they absorbed large portions of the Iberian Peninsula and they ruled it. They were finally stopped on the borders of what is now modern France in 722. In the centuries that followed, there was a very arduous, very costly struggle for the older Christian population of what we now call Spain to take back the territories that had come under Moorish rule. It was a movement that lasted for centuries, and it was called the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Spain, the retaking of Spain for its Catholic Christian population. But it was very gradual. It was very slow. During a period of approximately 7 centuries, while Moorish rule was eventually pushed and contained into the south of Spain, in the Kingdom of Granada, Moorish and Muslim people had become woven in to the fabric of Iberian culture. They had become part of Spain in a way that was impossible to erase. From architecture to medicine, from fashion to food, the Moorish or Muslim influence was everywhere evident. And you have probably seen pictures of the Alhambra or of the architecture in Cordoba or Seville. But even things as basic as food were enormously affected by the many centuries of Moorish population and cultural interpenetration that happened in Spain over this very long period. These Muslims from North Africa brought with them, for example, new irrigation systems. that allowed crops to be grown in Spain that had never been seen before. And amongst some of their well-known gifts were saffron, rice, grapefruit, and almonds. And a lot of signature Spanish dishes, like paella, for example, would be unimaginable without things like saffron and rice. And so, while most of the Iberian Peninsula, at the time our story begins, was no longer under Moorish rule, it would be a mistake to imagine that Moorish people weren't everywhere to be found. In many cities, there were populations of Christians, Muslims, and Jews that lived together as neighbors throughout Spain. And they spoke each other's languages. They shared ingredients, food, cultural influences, and music in a way that has been remarked on by scholars at great length ever since. In fact, Spain at this time had the largest Jewish population in Europe. And the Jewish population of Spain was multilingual, and in many cases they acted as translators or bridges across civilizations. This was most notable in the translation movement in the Spanish city of Toledo. So in the 12th and 13th centuries, Arab science and medicine was much farther advanced than what was found in Western Europe. This is well known. And it was largely because the Arabs, or the Muslims, who had exploded out of the Middle East and rapidly expanded, had studied the texts that they found in the territories that they conquered. There was a very famous translation movement in the 10th century in the city of Baghdad, in modern-day Iraq, sometimes called the Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom, where there was an organized, massive translation movement that was undertaken under the leadership of the governor there to make sure that these texts, which were often texts from ancient Greek, Roman culture, were translated into Arabic so that the learning, the discovery, and the science became accessible to Arab Muslims. As a result, mathematics and science in the Arab world blossomed. Algebra, which is a math term that many of us remember with a shudder from our high school days, is actually derived from an Arab scholar who benefited from this translation movement, and his name was Al-Jabr. So we get algebra from that name. So the Arabs had become a link in the transmission of knowledge from the ancient world into the Middle Ages. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Western Europe hadn't yet had the opportunity to benefit from these translations. In an attempt to catch up, the Archbishop of the Spanish city of Toledo organized another large-scale translation movement beginning in the 12th and going into the 13th century. Moorish and Jewish scholars worked alongside Catholic ones, translating ancient texts that had existed in Greek and Aramaic, which had then been translated into Hebrew and Arabic, and were now being transmitted again into Latin, making them accessible to the people of Spain and very soon to many others in Western Europe. In fact, this translation movement seeded the ground for the Renaissance, which takes off beginning in Italy in the 1400s, shortly after, as these classical texts begin to circulate in a format that is now accessible to Europeans. And there's this excitement and there's this inspiration that happens as the works of Cicero, for example, are being now read and appreciated again many centuries later. But this link between civilizations and the cross-cultural cooperation that happened in the translation movement of Toledo is often forgotten as a factor that enabled this. You might be wondering why the translation movement of Toledo was busy translating manuscripts from Arabic into Latin instead of, for example, into Spanish. And the answer to that is that Latin was the language of learning in the Middle Ages. Educated people, scholars, those who could read and write, would do so in Latin. And the vernacular languages, which would develop into modern Spanish, would be spoken by everybody, but that was not the language in which text transmission and scholarship was done. Isabella is born in 1451, the daughter of King Juan, who is the ruler of the Kingdom of Castile, the largest and richest of the kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. Now, you would think that she would be very fortunate being the daughter of a king, but in fact, she was considered a rather unimportant child. First of all, King Juan already had a son from his first marriage. So his previous queen had died, but she'd left him a son named Enrique, who was going to inherit the throne, and we'll be hearing a lot more about him shortly. King Juan had now married a second time, and his new queen had produced Princess Isabella, and a couple of years later would produce another son named Alfonso. Isabella was fair-skinned and light-haired, by all accounts a very attractive girl, even as an infant, and very intelligent. But nobody believed she would amount to much. After all, she was a girl, and so her destiny would be ultimately to be traded as a pawn for diplomatic alliances that could benefit her family or the kingdom. Her destiny was to be given a fairly standard education, minimal that would be, being a girl, and she would be expected to master the female skills, which would include things like needlework and the mending of shirts. So, being given an education in politics, government, or war, these are not subjects in which anyone thought fit to instruct the young princess. Now, King Juan died shortly thereafter, in 1454, leaving 3-year-old Isabella, her infant brother Alfonso, and her mother very much homeless, because custom dictated that the new king, Juan's son, Enrique, would take over inhabiting the palace and found his own family, and the widow of the dead king and her small children would have to leave and live in some smaller, less important residence farther away. So Isabella's world changed very rapidly, even at the age of 3 years old. Enrique was in his 20s when he inherited the throne. He was tall, blonde, athletic, and must have looked like a very promising candidate to be the king. Sadly, he had a great deal of difficulty living up to the role. Very early on, Enrique demonstrated a discomfort with ceremony, an unwillingness to hold himself apart as a king. He was very eager to have approval and enthusiasm from the people around him, and was willing to do almost anything to avoid conflict. He disdained formality, he didn't like to be addressed by his title, and he often fled from the duties of state, preferring to hunt by himself in the woods. So there were difficulties that emerged even in the early years of his reign, beginning with his wife, who, after several years of marriage which produced no heir, was dismissed on some ground that she had bewitched him and made him unable to perform his duties as a husband. So, blaming it on the woman, she was dismissed, and Enrique married a second time, and after several more years, finally produced an heir. Unfortunately, she was female. But Enrique's desperation to have the approval of the nobles and those in his court circle made him very vulnerable to manipulation. And sensing his weakness, sensing his unwillingness to direct firmly, and his willingness to rely on a couple of favorites and delegate many of his duties to them, King Enrique was soon easily manipulated by powerful Spanish grandees or aristocrats who began to demand increasing concessions, more land, more titles, the control of more Spanish cities with the revenues, the taxation revenues that would involve. And Enrique, who didn't like conflict, found himself just acquiescing to more and more ridiculous demands. Within a few years of becoming king, even Enrique was conscious of the fact that his nobles were unhappy with him, that there were murmurings and dissatisfaction about his performance as a king, to the point where he began to worry that his younger half-siblings, Princess Isabella and Prince Alfonso, might actually be used against him. And so while they were still children, age around 10 and younger, they were taken from their mother's care and brought to the palace where they could live more closely under the supervision of King Enrique and his second wife. Enrique's suspicions were not groundless. Civil unrest was not long in coming, and very soon, powerful aristocratic factions in Spain began to unite around the idea of an alternative king. and the only other male in the royal family was young Prince Alfonso, Isabella's brother, younger than her by 2 years. And so he became the focus of these rebellious factions who were tired of Enrique's ineffective rule and wanted to replace him with an alternative king. There were increasingly strident demands from these nobles. There were skirmishes between the king's troops and the armies that were funded and controlled by aristocratic factions. Matters reached an ugly crescendo on June the 5th, 1465, when rebel factions gathered in a town square and erected a raised platform. On this platform, they built a human-like dummy on a throne. And then in a horrible pantomime, which was witnessed by the public, this being in the middle of the plaza where everyone gathered, they read out their list of complaints and accusations, all the reasons why King Enrique was not fit to be king. And then in a very dramatic gesture, they took the crown, the false crown that they had on this dummy's head, off its head, and they threw the dummy from the platform onto the ground. But they weren't finished. It was at this moment that they brought up the 10-year-old Prince Alfonso, actually Prince Alfonso, not a dummy of Prince Alfonso, but they took the actual child, they brought him up onto this platform, and then they swore allegiance to him and placed their mime crown on his head. Now, this was a shocking moment because for many people, the doctrine of divine right of kings was one that was deeply rooted culturally. The idea was that the king ruled by the grace of God, that he was an authority that had been set up over citizens and nobles alike, and that his power was sanctioned by the divine. And the corollary of that is that to rebel against the power of the king would be to rebel against the natural order of things and ultimately the will of God. So this act, for many people who watched it, was sacrilegious. It wasn't just political pantomime. It cut at the very foundation of the order of things. But the aristocrats involved thought that the king was incompetent, they had the ability to change him, and they wished to replace him with somebody else. And this was a very visual way of demonstrating their intention to do just that. However, word of this town square pantomime spread rapidly. The king heard about it, and so did many other towns and families and aristocratic clans that hadn't been present there. It was a way of throwing down the gauntlet and saying, you were going to have to take sides in what was going to be a civil war. Were you going to support the rebel faction and try to crown a new king, this Prince Alfonso, or were you going to remain loyal to King Enrique with all of his faults? And so people had to choose sides. Every town, every city, every noble family had to decide where they were going to stand in the conflict that was now bubbling over. The civil unrest quickly spilled from pantomime into actual battlefields. Very soon, there were fights happening between forces that were loyal to King Enrique and forces that were controlled by noble families on the rebel side. But in addition to the actual fighting and bloodshed that was happening as these parties contested for the power of the throne, there was a space for lawlessness that opened up as well. Because without a centralized government, while many of the people in charge of law and order were busy fighting each other, it was very easy for criminals to do things and get away with them. So for the everyday person living in a Spanish city at this time, the level of safety would decline. You would be more vulnerable to theft as you were traveling from one place to another, or to violence, to people taking advantage of the lack of enforcement and the lack of law and order to get away with things that they thought they could. So this period was a very difficult one for many people, and the longer it went on, the worse the cost became for the average person. Now, King Enrique decided that his best strategy was to marry his half-sister, Isabella, to the King of Portugal. Isabella is the older sister of Prince Alfonso, who has become the figurehead of the rebellion. But she's Politically, under King Enrique's control, she's a member of his family and she can be traded for political capital. So Enrique's play is that if he marries his half-sister to the King of Portugal, which is a neighboring country that borders Spain, then the King of Portugal becomes his ally and can send money and, more importantly, military troops to aid Enrique in his battle against rebels inside Spain. The rebels got wind of this plan and didn't like it at all. So to head off this possibility, they proposed peace talks with King Enrique, which the king, hoping to see an end to this messy conflict, was happy to attend. The leaders representing the rebel side promised that they would abandon their rebellion and once again swear allegiance to the king if King Enrique would instead marry Isabella to a member of one of their own families. So for Enrique, the benefit was a quick end to a very expensive and very unsettling civil war. But for the rebels, it was a very cunning play because, in fact, it prevented King Enrique bringing in a very powerful ally who could then be used at any time when trouble could come in the future. So they would avert that possibility while also greatly strengthening a family on their side, which would now have married into the royal family itself. It was for this reason that at the tender age of 15, Princess Isabella found herself engaged to a Spanish nobleman, 43 years old, by the name of Pedro Girón. While the deal satisfied both the king and the rebels, young Isabella was absolutely horrified. Pedro Girón was described as crude, jowly, foul-mouthed, and lecherous. So in other words, a fat and disgusting creep. That would be the translation of his description into the vernacular that we would use today. And a more horrifying prospect for a 15-year-old girl could scarcely be imagined. But there was nothing Isabella could do about it. She had no say in who she was going to marry. Her sole purpose was to serve as a pawn in some such deal as this, and her half-brother the king had decided that this was going to be her destiny. So there are accounts of Isabel retreating to her room for days at a time, fasting and praying. So she's declining food, she's spending all her hours in prayer, and the nature of her prayers is, "Dear God, please take my life before this happens." So what we learn about Isabella at this point is that she's quite devout. She's been raised with very strong Catholic ideas and values, and this is also why she's not committing suicide. That would have been considered a great sin, a mortal sin. And so while Isabella clearly thought that death was preferable to marrying the man that she had been betrothed to, all she could do was pray that death might be given to her. She did not feel that she could take matters into her own hands. As the day of her wedding draws near, Pedro Girón sets out from his estate in a company of his nobles and attendants to make the several days' journey to where Princess Isabella is staying so that the wedding can take place. And as he sets out, onlookers report seeing a large flock of storks in the sky. You know, the stork, the long, sort of awkward bird that was rumored to have brought people babies. Well, they didn't have a positive connotation at this point. The seeing of storks for the people in the Iberian Peninsula in the 1400s, especially in large numbers, was thought to be a bad omen, a sign that something was wrong. And very soon afterwards, Pedro Girón is forced to stop his progress towards Princess Isabella because he begins to suffer from a very severe abscess in his throat. So he has to stop his journey, he has to pull over and take refuge at some roadside inn or somebody's house. And after a couple of days of acute and very painful suffering, he dies. But reportedly, not before cursing God for not allowing him a few more days to enjoy the great increase in his rank that would have been acquired had he succeeded in marrying the princess. Now, you can only imagine the relief that 15-year-old Isabella must have felt when she heard this. And she could only have regarded it as a miracle, as an answer to her prayers, that somehow this hideous fate had been averted by divine intervention. So Isabella retains this memory and her faith in God as a very strong plank of her personal identity, which we'll see as our story continues. However, the fact that this marriage between Princess Isabella and Pedro Giron did not occur meant that matters were once again at a standoff between the rebels and the king. The terms of the peace deal had not been met, and so conflict resumed. However, the rebellion was stopped by another unexpected death in 1468. This time, it was young Prince Alfonso, who suddenly expired due to what onlookers suspected was a case of bubonic plague. Yes, the Black Death. It was circulating in many towns and cities in the Iberian Peninsula at that time. There would be localized outbreaks. A town would close up its doors and walls once they had identified that they were infected and outsiders would not be allowed in. The plague would have to run its course, and then it would pop up somewhere else. So people didn't have a lot of knowledge in terms of where to expect it to next emerge or how to prevent it. And it seems that the prince was very likely exposed to it because he had recently visited a city in which there had been a plague outbreak. Although his body didn't demonstrate any of the sores, the pustules, especially around the throat and the mouth or the armpits that were very characteristic of the bubonic plague. Some scholars think that he got a version of pneumonic plague, which is basically the same disease, but it's transmitted a little bit differently, and the mortality rate is far higher. In any case, whatever the actual cause, young Prince Alfonso was dead, and so the figurehead of the rebellion had suddenly disappeared. Their alternative king candidate was no more, and so a lot of the momentum suddenly evaporated. No doubt King Enrique was deeply relieved at this very convenient death of his young half-brother, but this did leave Castile, the Kingdom of Castile, in a difficult situation, because with Prince Alfonso's death, there were now only 2 heirs to the throne who might inherit after King Enrique's death, and both of them were female. Castile had been ruled by queens before, very occasionally, in the centuries past, but typically they were ruling as the widows of kings who had died, or they were ruling as regents, so looking after the kingdom while their young sons were coming of age. They hadn't been crowned as queens in their own right. They had sort of been stand-in figures in between legitimate male rulers. To crown a queen in her own right as the political ruler of Castile was a bold move and not something that had been done before. However, Princess Isabella was not willing to step in and be the figurehead for an ongoing rebellion against her half-brother, King Enrique. She'd already witnessed the devastation and the death, as well as the suffering that these years of civil unrest had caused in Castile, and she also may have taken her younger brother's death as a sign that God was displeased with this rebellion. So there were peace talks once again between the rebels and King Enrique in the September of that year. The peace agreement demanded that Princess Isabella and the rebels would respect and obey King Enrique from that point forward. But in exchange, King Enrique would agree to officially declare his half-sister, Princess Isabella, as the heir to the throne, so that when he died, the throne would be hers. And this would satisfy the rebels. The king also agreed that Princess Isabella would receive the revenues from certain cities that would then be under her rule, so she would be financially supported in that way. And further, that he would not compel her to marry without her consent, and the consent of other nobles, including the rebels. But, on the flip side, Princess Isabella had to agree not to marry without King Enrique's consent either. In a shocking clause, the rebels also demanded that King Enrique divorce his existing wife and send her and the child, the daughter that they'd had together, into exile. I'll explain in a moment why they insisted on this apparently bizarre clause. But when this agreement was hammered out and agreed to by both sides, there was an enormous sense of relief that the years of civil war the ruinous costs of battles and lawlessness could now be at an end. Now, King Enrique was a man who seemed to be willing to say or do whatever was necessary to just quell a conflict and make a problem go away. And looking down the road at the consequences of some of those agreements or concessions that he might have made doesn't seem to have been his strong point. In particular, you can imagine what happened the day he went home and his wife, the Queen, found out about the terms of the peace deal that he'd just agreed to. She might rightly have asked that if a woman was going to inherit the throne of Castile, why should it not be King Enrique's own daughter, Princess Juana, who was a product of their marriage? I mean, her outrage would be entirely understandable, and the idea that she herself and her daughter would be divorced and thrown out of the country must have seemed beyond outrageous. Now, while the Queen's sentiments would be only natural, the legitimacy of her child, Princess Juana, was something that was heavily criticized by the rebels and had been for years. They alleged that the princess had been fathered not by King Enrique, but by another man. And there were some legitimate grounds for having this suspicion. It was an easy allegation to make, since the Queen was known to have had affairs and to have produced children as a result of those affairs. Rumor had it that King Enrique was impotent, or even gay, and they had therefore encouraged his wife to seek sexual satisfaction elsewhere, while failing to do his kingly duty in the bedroom as apparently everywhere else. So the fact that the Queen had had other sexual partners and children as a result of those unions was actually widely known, and therefore it was very easy to allege that this particular daughter probably wasn't King Enrique's child anyway, so not a legitimate heir to the throne. But there was a further twist. King Enrique and his queen were actually cousins. And this was very common amongst royal families in Europe at the time. If you were listening to my other podcasts on Henry VIII, you'll know that special permission from the Pope had to be sought, even by kings, if they wanted to marry somebody who was a blood relative, such as a cousin. King Enrique and his wife were actually cousins. But they'd gotten married before getting official permission from the Pope to do this. And that permission was expected to come. It had kind of been promised. Like, take a little while, see how it goes. We'll be happy to send you the official paperwork to make this legitimate. No problem. But the paperwork never actually got done. And so this left poor Princess Juana open to the charge that she was the product of an illegitimate marriage, even if King Enrique was actually her biological father. To us, the idea of marrying cousins or family members is sort of deeply disgusting. It's become a cultural taboo. But for royal families in Europe at this time, it was very common. The ideas of uncles marrying nieces, of first cousins marrying each other, was very widespread. And this was just another example of one of those marriages, which in this case led to the criticism of legitimacy of the child. The accusation that a queen had had sexual partners aside from the king was a very potent one throughout the European courts for a long time, whether the accusation was actually justified or not. In the case of this queen, it was a well-known fact, so it wasn't something that was contrived. But even the rumor of something like that could be absolutely poisonous and end a political career. So, under enormous pressure from his wife at home, and under pressure from the rebels who he'd signed an agreement with, King Enrique had a very uncomfortable situation where he vacillated between, at times, seeming to support Princess Isabella as the future heir to the throne, and at other times leaning toward his own daughter, Princess Juana. And this wavering would actually go on for a number of years. But in the immediate months following this very important peace deal with the rebels, people were watching King Enrique very closely. Princess Isabella had a circle of close advisors who were looking out for her interests, and of course for their own, because if she were to succeed in being queen, they would benefit directly from that. So they were looking for signs that the king wasn't going to follow through on the agreement he'd made. And indeed, there was evidence of that even in the months directly afterwards. The cities that Isabella was supposed to have control over and derive her financial support from weren't handed over. And also, King Enrique began to pressure her again to marry the King of Portugal, which, remember, was his idea originally to get leverage over the rebels in Spain, was to marry Isabella to this powerful ally. So now that he's made a deal, he's once again moving in a direction that strengthens his hand against the rebels and potentially empowers him to continue not following through on the terms of their agreement. While Isabella is supposed to be protected by the terms of this agreement and allegedly can't be forced into a marriage, she's still available to be traded as a pawn for diplomatic alliances, although presumably the king will have to go through a little bit more discussion with some of these nobles before making a decision and just sending Isabella to the court of some future bridegroom. So in addition to receiving a marriage proposal from the King of Portugal, Isabella also receives a proposal from a younger prince in France and others besides. So there's this sort of stir, there's this buzz about who Isabella is going to marry and what the political implications of that decision are going to be. But one proposal that comes to Isabella comes from the neighboring kingdom of Aragon. Inside Spain itself, Castile's eastern neighbor. So they share a border. Aragon is the next largest kingdom. It's not as wealthy as Castile. It shares many of the same traditions and culture. And the prince, Ferdinand, who is the one being proposed to marry Princess Isabella, is actually related to her. Not as a first cousin, but apparently they share the same great-grandfather. So in the larger bloodline, they are in fact related. This is a benefit, by the way. It would have been seen as a credit to his account at the time. So being allied to another kingdom inside Spain that could provide military troops and financial support would definitely strengthen Isabella's position and make it more likely that she could inherit or take the throne of Castile if necessary when the time came. Whereas a match with someone outside of Spain, like King Alfonso, would strengthen King Enrique's hand, but very much disable Isabella's ability to rule Castile in her own right. Now, King Enrique is aware of the interest in Isabella from the Kingdom of Aragon, and he opposes it because he's fully aware of the political implications that will have and how Isabella's position will improve as a result. So he is very much opposed, and Isabella needs his official consent before she can be married by the terms of the agreement that has been made between the king and the rebels. However, her closest advisor secretly polls many of the rebel families to see if they would be supportive of the match with the Kingdom of Aragon, and they say yes. And so her advisors have to proceed with negotiations with the King of Aragon in secrecy, because the King of Castile, Enrique, can't know anything about it. He would oppose it. So they, behind closed doors, with secret messages, hammer out a deal in which the King of Aragon will send very expensive gifts of jewelry and money to Isabella as an engagement present if an agreement is signed that will promise that she marries his son, Prince Ferdinand. The King of Aragon has his own interest in this deal. He's being menaced by France, which lies on his border. And so there's ongoing pressure for contested territories that he wants to retain control over, but which the French king is desirous to absorb. And so the King of Aragon is hoping that if he can marry his son to the Princess of Castile, and hopefully the future ruler of Castile, that he will have secured for himself a powerful ally to strengthen his own kingdom as well. So in secret, an agreement is signed between representatives of Princess Isabella and representatives of the King of Aragon, promising that she will marry Prince Ferdinand. She's 18 at the time. Now, because Castile is larger and more powerful than the Kingdom of Aragon, Isabel's noble or aristocratic advisors are very keen to ensure that Isabella retains the right to govern Castile herself. They don't want her to marry Ferdinand and then to have Castile absorbed into the territory of Aragon, essentially, to be ruled by Ferdinand when he inherits the throne. They don't want Princess Isabella to just be a queen whose job it is to produce children but has no political power. She belongs to Castile, and they wish Castile to remain independent and therefore to be governed by Isabella alone. So even though she's a woman, she's their woman, and she's preferable to Ferdinand or his father as a ruler of their kingdom. Because of these considerations, they hammer out a very surprising list of demands. Capitulations, actually, that Prince Ferdinand will have to make, or promises, before they're going to agree to let Princess Isabella become engaged to him. These capitulations restricted Ferdinand's rights in Castile to basically just being royal consort. So what this means is that if he marries Princess Isabella, he might be a future king in his own kingdom of Aragon, but in Castile, he's just the royal husband. And all the authority to govern Castile, to make decisions, to make important appointments to significant posts, to decide to go to war or not, all of these rest in Isabella's hands alone. They further require that Prince Ferdinand will reside in Castile with his future wife. So even though he's going to inherit the throne of Aragon, he's going to have to live in Castile, and he's not allowed to leave that kingdom without his wife's permission. Also, any children that they might have together, he won't be allowed to take them out of Castile without Isabella's permission either. So Ferdinand's role as royal husband is very similar to the role played by Prince Philip to the late Queen Elizabeth II of England. Prince Philip was just the royal husband. He wasn't the head of state, and he did not have political power to do anything. He attended ceremonies, he served a number of sort of formal functions, but all the real political power lay in the hands of the queen. That's essentially the same deal that Castile, well, Isabella's advisors in Castile, were insisting on from Ferdinand and his family. In addition, if Isabella required military support to secure her claim to the throne of Castile, Ferdinand and his family would be obligated to provide troops. Now, these capitulations no doubt raised eyebrows on the side representing Prince Ferdinand and Aragon. They were unusual to say the least. But Castile was in a powerful position. It was larger and wealthier. And so, really, Aragon needed Castile more than Castile needed Aragon. And therefore, Castile was in this position where they could insist on what they wanted as terms of this deal. And they did. However, Ferdinand's advisors might have assumed that no matter what the letter of the agreement was, the traditional supremacy of a husband over a wife would in fact prevail in this marriage, as it did in pretty much all of them. So whatever was written in the actual agreement, in principle, Ferdinand would have authority and a far greater range of powers than might be written on paper. It seemed a very safe assumption to make. Even though the agreement had been inked, the terms had been hammered out and agreed to, this was still a secret deal. King Enrique didn't know anything about it, and they had to wait until he was out of town to proceed with executing this plan, because otherwise he could have seized Princess Isabella and found ways to completely obstruct and destroy the deal. The wedding would actually have to be carried off without the king's knowledge. Isabella's advisors waited until King Enrique traveled out of the palace, heading south to towns far near the southern border where there were rebellious stirrings still. And so the king needed to go and put down this unrest. He had to take care of problems. He was going to be many miles from home. And this was going to be the golden moment when they could execute this plan. So while Enrique was about to depart on this military mission, he was aware that Princess Isabella might be the target of something from Aragon, and he very much wanted to prevent anything like that from happening. So he left Isabella in a palace under the supervision of some noble families that were loyal to him, with strict instructions to make sure that she stayed under watch and she did as she was told and didn't see anybody, like foreign advisors or whatever. And Isabella had to promise her half-brother, King Enrique, that she would stay there in that town until he returned. But of course, she needed to leave this town, and she needed to be free of the spies and the guardians who'd been set over her in order to secretly marry the Prince of Aragon. So she has to contrive an excuse to get out from under the vigilance of the Watchers, who she's been left with. And finally, she contrives an excuse that almost nobody could say no to. She said, well, it's been a certain amount of time since my brother, Prince Alfonso, died. I need to go and perform funeral rites for him in this other small town. That was the pretext, but she left on horseback in the middle of the night. She fled, knowing that when she did so, it would be considered an act of treason by her brother, the king, when he found out. But she flees anyway, and she flees toward towns and fortresses that are controlled by rebels who are loyal to her. Meanwhile, Prince Ferdinand journeys into the kingdom of Castile in disguise. He's not riding a fancy horse. He's not wearing an elaborate outfit. He wears dirty, common clothes, like a mule driver. So completely inconspicuous, like a commoner, a laborer that no one would stop. And it's in this guise that he safely manages to enter Castile unremarked, nobody pays attention to him, and to reach a fortress held by the rebels who are waiting for his arrival. Now, Ferdinand was a year younger than Isabella. He was a 17-year-old youth. But by the standards of the time, he was considered quite attractive. He was a decent height, he was very athletic, he was good at hunting and jousting and all the sort of chivalric activities that were expected of young men of noble rank. And further, he was supposed to have an affability and an easy grace with people that made him very popular. He was easy to like. And so he was considered to be quite charming. Rumor had it that even though he was only 17, he had already had a couple of mistresses, and possibly even some children. For Isabella, who had to choose her marriage entirely on political considerations, this young man must have seemed like a very charming prince indeed, compared to the middle-aged, horrifying suitors that she had so nearly gotten stuck with. There's evidence that Ferdinand also found his future bride very attractive. Isabella is reported to be light-skinned, with eyes that were bluish-green, and a very rare color of strawberry blonde hair. So she was considered quite striking, quite beautiful, actually. She had a dignity and a grace that many people remarked on, but she was also very intelligent and, under an apparently meek and pleasant disposition, extremely strong-willed, which was a fact that Ferdinand might not have realized on his first encounter, but which was going to become an inescapable reality of his married life. But these fortunate young people had the rare experience of finding that a politically necessary marriage was also a personally desirable one as well. And the affection and attraction between these two young people who were married in secret, outside of public view, in this way was something that would be the beginning of a very, very powerful relationship. When the two future spouses met before their wedding, Isabella's advisors wanted to insist that Prince Ferdinand sort of bend his head and kiss her hand to acknowledge her superior rank, or really the superior rank of Castile over Aragon. And Isabella wouldn't have it. She didn't want any sort of deference of that kind. She wanted to meet her future husband as an equal. And this was her vision of the marriage that they were going to have. Ferdinand was not yet aware of how serious his future wife was about the equality of their status, but he would soon find out. The marriage between Ferdinand and Isabella was a promise. It was a promise that in the future, their two separate kingdoms could be united, with more territory in the Iberian Peninsula under a single crown than had ever before been seen. This, of course, could only happen if Ferdinand and Isabella each inherited the thrones of their separate kingdoms. And there was King Enrique to worry about, so this hadn't yet occurred. But this marriage laid the foundation for the nation of Spain as a united country, rather than a collection of small kingdoms and principalities. This marriage, undertaken in secret, under somewhat treasonous conditions, laid the foundation for the unification of Spain as a nation-state, as one country under one crown, rather than a collection of separate kings and small kingdoms warring amongst themselves. And the marriage between Ferdinand and Isabella, the decisions that they will make as a royal couple when they do inherit the crowns of their respective kingdoms, will put Spain on the path to becoming the most powerful country in Europe. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Villains and Virgins podcast. It's the first in a series, so to find out what happens next, be sure you subscribe so you can catch episodes 2, 3, 4, and perhaps even more. Please consider sharing it with someone else that you think would enjoy this story. You can catch the podcast anywhere you listen to audio, from Spotify to Amazon to Apple, wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can get the illustrated version on YouTube if you search for my name, Eva Schubert. Hopefully I'll see you in the next episode.